Title: The Veil of Shadows. Chapter 1: The Call of the Past. Edgar Freeman's grip tightened on the cold brass doorknob. As he swung the door open, the room seemed to inhale around him, as though the house itself were taking a deep breath, bracing for his presence. The musty scent of decay filled his nostrils, sharp and sour, mingling with the unmistakable smell of damp wood and rotting fabric. He stepped into the dark room cautiously, holding the oil lamp up high to peer into every corner. The flickering light cast elongated shadows that danced along the walls, stretching across the floor and onto the ceiling like the twisted, grasping fingers of long-dead inhabitants. The cradle sat there, silent and still, bathed in a soft, pale glow from the moonlight streaming through the half-curtained window. He took a few steps closer, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the small, dust-laden object lying just beside the cradle. A doll, its face turned away from him. He knelt, his hand trembling as he reached for it, the tips of his fingers brushing the worn, cracked porcelain. As he lifted it, the doll's head rolled forward, its empty, hollow eyes gazing back at him. A faded, eerie smile was painted onto its face, frozen in a grimace that seemed more mocking than innocent. Just as he was about to pull his hand away, a sharp noise cut through the silence, a soft, steady tap, 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 echoing down the hall outside the room. He froze, holding his breath, his heartbeat thundering in his chest. The tapping continued, slow and rhythmic, each sound punctuated by a slight pause, as though something were taking its time, savoring the anticipation. With a shiver, he rose to his feet, leaving the doll where it lay. He stepped back into the hallway, his gaze darting down the darkened corridor. The tapping grew louder, echoing through the house with a sinister clarity that seemed almost intentional, as though the sound were designed to lure him deeper, to coax him toward whatever horrors awaited in the shadows. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to take a step forward, then another, his eyes scanning the walls, where portraits of past occupants hung in somber silence. Their eyes, painted in faded, lifeless hues, seemed to follow him as he moved, their expressions twisted in grief, or perhaps in warning. One particular portrait, hung slightly askew, depicted a young woman with sorrowful eyes, her face marred by a faint, almost invisible scratch across her cheek. The scratch was so slight that he might have overlooked it, if not for the strange pull he felt, as though she were trying to tell him something, to reveal some terrible truth hidden beneath the surface of her painted smile. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so deep it seemed to press in on him from all sides, wrapping around him like a shroud. He could hear his own breathing, ragged and shallow, echoing back at him as though the walls were mocking his fear. He clenched his jaw, willing himself to be brave, to continue down the hallway toward the source of the sound. At the end of the corridor, he found himself standing before another door, slightly ajar, with a faint sliver of light spilling out from the room beyond. He hesitated, his hand hovering above the doorknob, his mind racing with thoughts of what might lie on the other side. He could feel the presence of something unseen, something ancient and malevolent, lurking just out of sight, waiting for him to make his move. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest as the room beyond was revealed. It was a small, cluttered space, filled with old furniture draped in white sheets, and a single cracked window that cast an eerie, fragmented light across the room. Shadows stretched and warped across the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to shift and writhe as he moved deeper into the room. In the center of the room stood a tall, floor-length mirror, its glass cloudy and fractured, as though it had been shattered and then painstakingly pieced back together. Edgar stepped closer, unable to tear his eyes away from the strange, distorted reflection staring back at him. His own face appeared twisted and misshapen, his features blurred and ghostly, as though he were staring not at himself, but at some hollow imitation, a version of himself that existed only in nightmares. As he gazed into the mirror, a figure began to materialize behind him, its form growing clearer with each passing second. It was tall, gaunt and draped in shadow, its face obscured by darkness, but its eyes, cold, lifeless eyes, stared back at him with a predatory intensity. He felt a chill race down his spine, paralyzing him with a terror so profound it felt as though his heart might stop. In an instant, the figure was gone, leaving him alone with his fractured reflection. He stumbled back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps, the weight of the room pressing down on him with an almost physical force. He turned to leave, desperate to escape the suffocating darkness, but as he reached the door, he felt a cold, invisible hand grip his shoulder, stopping him in his tracks. A voice, barely more than a whisper, drifted through the air, filling the room with a haunting melody that sent chills through his bones. It was soft and lilting, a lullaby sung in a language he did not recognize, but its tone was unmistakable, a mournful, sorrowful sound, filled with a longing that seemed to resonate deep within his soul. "Remember," the voice whispered, the word hanging in the air like a thick fog, wrapping around him, seeping into his mind. He stumbled out of the room, slamming the door behind him, and raced down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls seemed to close in around him, the house alive with a sinister energy that pulsed beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. He could feel it in every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the cracked windows. A presence, ancient and malevolent, lurking just beyond the veil, watching him with a cold, calculating gaze. He reached the front door, his hand fumbling with the lock as he struggled to free himself from the house's suffocating grip. As he finally threw the door open and stepped out into the cool night air, he felt a strange sense of relief wash over him, mingled with a deep, lingering dread. But as he looked back at the house, standing dark and silent against the moonlit sky, he realized that whatever haunted its walls had already begun to seep into him, rooting itself deep within his soul. The house had claimed him, in a way that he could not yet understand, and he knew that no matter how far he ran, it would follow him, haunting his every step. And from the shadows, a pair of cold, lifeless eyes watched him go, waiting patiently for his return. Chapter 2. The Forgotten Letters. The morning light barely pierced through the fog that hung thick over the lake, casting a pallid, ghostly glow that did nothing to dispel the dread lingering from the previous night. Edgar awoke with a start, his heart racing as fragments of a nightmare flitted through his mind. Shadowy figures, hollow faces, and a voice calling out from some unknown depth, pleading with him to remember. He rose, glancing nervously around the room, the events of the previous night vivid in his memory. He felt the pull of the house again, the same dark magnetism that had driven him to explore the halls last night. Every corner seemed to hold a secret, every wall murmuring with whispers too faint to hear. He shook his head, trying to brush off the unease. In an attempt to clear his mind, Edgar went to the kitchen. As he poured his coffee, he noticed the faded newspaper ad he had used to find this place lying on the countertop. The ink was smudged, the paper itself brittle, as if it had been sitting here for decades instead of just a few weeks. Something about the ad felt wrong, as though it had appeared in his life with purpose, pulling him into this desolate place with the quiet certainty of a trap. Compelled by an almost hypnotic urge, Edgar wandered back toward the staircase and up to the attic door. It was a small, nondescript door at the end of the hall, almost hidden in plain sight. He tried the handle, surprised when it turned easily, and pulled the door open. The smell of mildew and dust washed over him, thick and stale, filling his nose and clinging to his skin. He stepped up into the dim attic, where only faint beams of light slipped through cracks in the walls, casting eerie patterns on the floor. Among the clutter and cobwebs, Edgar spotted a small, locked chest nestled against the far wall. It was a strange-looking box, its edges decorated with intricate carvings that seemed almost to shift as he moved closer. A shiver ran down his spine as he reached for it, his fingers brushing over the carvings. They felt cold and rough, each line etched deep, as though they'd been carved by something sharp and unforgiving. He found a rusted key lying nearby, as though someone had left it there intentionally. With a trembling hand, he inserted the key into the lock, feeling an odd sense of resistance before it finally clicked open. Inside, he found a stack of yellowed, brittle letters bound together by a thin, fraying string. Edgar sat back on his heels, taking the letters in his hands. They felt heavy, as though they carried a weight beyond their physical form. Each envelope was worn and delicate, the edges torn and smudged, and the ink faded with time. The handwriting was cramped and uneven, written with a hand that had clearly trembled under some great strain. As he opened the first letter, a wave of dread washed over him. The words, though faint, seemed to leap off the page, winding their way into his mind with a disturbing clarity. November 3rd, 1938. I write this now with trembling hands and a heart heavy with regret. The shadows grow bolder each night, their whispers filling the silence with a madness that gnaws at my soul. There is something in this house, something that will not rest, that demands an audience, a witness to its suffering. It seeks to reveal its story, but at what cost? The letter continued, filled with a frantic tone that seemed to bleed desperation, as if the writer were on the edge of sanity. Edgar's hands shook as he turned the page, compelled to read on despite the knot of fear tightening in his stomach. I have seen her, the letter went on. The woman by the lake. She appears only at night, a figure shrouded in mist, her face obscured by shadows. She watches the house, standing silent and still, waiting for something, for someone. I tried to call out to her once, but she vanished, leaving only the faint sound of weeping in her wake. It is as if the lake itself holds her spirit captive, bound to these shores by some force I cannot understand. Edgar's breath caught in his throat. The woman by the lake, the same figure he had seen in his dreams, in his nightmares. A dark part of him wondered if he had been drawn here, not by accident, but by something far more sinister, some force that knew he could not resist the call of the unknown. The following letters were filled with a progression of Lawrence's descent. Each entry seemed darker than the last, as though the writer had been slowly consumed by whatever presence haunted the house. In one letter, Lawrence described a sensation Edgar knew all too well, a feeling of being watched, of an unseen gaze following him from room to room, tracking his every move with a predatory patience. I cannot escape her, Lawrence wrote. Every corner of this house is filled with her presence, a silent tormentor who knows my every fear, my every weakness. I feel her eyes upon me even now as I write these words, her cold gaze piercing through the walls, whispering secrets I dare not speak aloud. Edgar shivered, the words sending a chill down his spine. He looked around the attic, half expecting to see a shadow lurking in the corner, watching him with those same hollow, accusing eyes. The silence pressed down on him, thick and heavy, as though the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for him to uncover its final secret. He continued reading, the words blurring together as his mind raced with fragments of images, visions of the lake, of a woman standing by the shore, her face obscured by darkness, her figure shifting in and out of sight like a mirage. He could almost hear her voice, a faint whisper that seemed to rise and fall with the rhythm of his heartbeat. I cannot bear it any longer, the last letter read. The weight of my guilt, my sins, it is too much to bear. She knows, she sees it all, and she will not rest until I have paid for what I have done. This house, this cursed place, it holds my soul as tightly as it holds hers. I can feel the end approaching, a dark and endless sleep from which there is no escape. The final line was scrawled with such force that the pen had torn through the paper, as though the writer's hand had trembled with a fear so profound it had left a physical scar upon the page. Edgar felt a strange connection to Lawrence's words, as though they were not just a record of a stranger's descent into madness, but a warning. A message left for him. A glimpse into a fate that awaited him if he stayed in this cursed house. He placed the letters back into the chest, feeling the weight of their secrets pressing down upon him. As he closed the lid, a faint sound echoed through the attic. A soft, steady tapping that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was the same sound he had heard the night before, the same deliberate rhythm that had lured him down the hallway. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as he stood, his eyes darting around the attic. The shadows seemed to shift, writhing like living things, twisting and stretching across the walls with a life of their own. The tapping grew louder, echoing through the silence, filling his mind with a sense of impending doom. Unable to bear the sound any longer, Edgar turned and fled, stumbling down the narrow staircase, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. He could feel the weight of the house bearing down on him, pressing in from all sides, as though the very walls were alive, pulsing with a dark, malevolent energy. He reached the bottom of the stairs, gasping for breath, his heart racing as he struggled to make sense of what he had just read. The house was not just haunted by the spirits of the past. It was a living, breathing entity, filled with the memories of those it had consumed, each one trapped in an endless cycle of fear and despair. As he stood there, a faint voice drifted through the air, soft and mournful, a whisper that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. "Remember?" The word echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of the secrets he had unearthed, the dark history that bound him to this place. He felt a strange compulsion, a pull toward the lake, toward the woman he had seen in his dreams. He knew that his only hope of breaking free from the house's grip lay in uncovering the truth, in facing the dark history that had claimed so many before him. With a final glance back at the house, Edgar stepped outside, his eyes fixed on the mist-covered lake. The air was thick with silence, heavy with the weight of unspoken secrets, and as he took his first step toward the shore, he felt a cold wind brush against his face, carrying with it the faint scent of decay and the unmistakable sound of weeping. The house watched him go, its windows dark and empty, its secrets waiting patiently in the shadows. Edgar knew that he was not the first to be lured into its embrace, and he would not be the last. As he approached the lake, he felt the weight of the letters pressing against him. The words etched into his mind like a brand, a reminder of the fate that awaited him if he dared to dig too deep. But the compulsion was too strong, the need to understand too great, and with each step, he felt himself sinking deeper into the mystery, into the darkness that had haunted this place for generations. And from the shadows, the woman watched, her hollow eyes filled with a sorrow that transcended time, her presence a lingering reminder of the price that must be paid. This chapter immerses Edgar in the terrifying discovery of the house's past, while building suspense around his inevitable connection to its secrets and the haunting woman by the lake. Chapter 3. The Hollow Eyes. The fog was thicker than ever the next morning, draping the house in a cloak of grey that blotted out the sky. Edgar barely slept, his mind filled with the words from Lawrence's letters, the weight of the house's secrets pressing down on him. The faint weeping from the lake echoed in his ears, a haunting melody that lingered even in the daylight. But the worst part, the part that clawed at him from the inside, was the vision. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, hollow eyes staring back at him, filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to pull him in, as though he were drowning in her grief. He spent the morning wandering the house, feeling as though he were being watched. Every creak, every shadow seemed to follow him, tracking his movements with a silent intensity. The faces in the old portraits stared down at him with expressions frozen in various shades of fear and sorrow, their eyes seeming to follow him no matter where he turned. Finally, he found himself back in the room with the large, cracked mirror, the same room where he had first seen the shadowed figure. The mirror's surface was cloudy, smeared with dust and grime, but as he stared into it, a faint outline began to form. It was as though someone were standing just behind him, a shadow blending into the darkness. His heart pounded as he took a step closer, wiping a small patch of the mirror clean with his sleeve. The figure became clearer, its face just barely visible in the reflection. A woman, her hollow eyes gazing back at him with a sorrowful intensity that sent chills through his veins. A sudden whisper filled the room, so faint he could barely make it out, yet unmistakable. "Help me!" The words seemed to seep through the mirror, wrapping around him like a fog. Edgar felt a strange compulsion, an urge to reach out, to touch the mirror, to bridge the gap between himself and the figure. But as his fingers brushed the glass, an icy shock jolted through him, filling him with a sense of dread so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. The mirror fogged over again, erasing the figure, but the whisper lingered, echoing in his mind with a desperation that felt all too real. Shaken, Edgar left the room, trying to shake off the lingering sensation of her presence. He felt as though she were following him, her hollow eyes watching him from every shadow, every corner of the house. The silence pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating, and he found himself wandering without direction, as though drawn by an invisible force. The library. Edgar's wandering led him to a door he hadn't noticed before, hidden in a shadowed alcove at the end of the hall. He pushed it open, revealing a small, dusty library filled with shelves of ancient leather-bound books. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and decay. a smell that seemed to cling to his skin as he stepped inside. The books were lined up neatly on the shelves, their spines faded and cracked, their titles barely legible. He reached out, tracing his fingers over the covers, feeling the weight of the years that had passed since they were last touched. One book in particular caught his eye, a thick black volume with no title. It was covered in strange symbols, faintly etched into the leather, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under his gaze. Edgar pulled it from the shelf, feeling an unexplainable sense of dread as he opened it. The pages were filled with drawings, dark, haunting images of twisted figures, faces frozen in expressions of fear and anguish. He flipped through the pages, each one more disturbing than the last, until he reached a section filled with writing, scrawled in a shaky hand. It was Lawrence's handwriting, unmistakable in its frantic, uneven strokes. Edgar's heart raced as he read the words, the sentences forming a story that was all too familiar. She comes to me in the night, her hollow eyes filled with a sorrow that cuts through my very soul. I see her by the lake, her figure blurred by mist, her voice a whisper that calls to me, begging for release. But there is no release, not for her, not for me. We are bound to this place, trapped by the sins we cannot escape. The words sent a chill down Edgar's spine, a creeping sense of dread wrapping around him like a shroud. He turned the page, his hands trembling as he read the next entry. I have seen what lies beneath her sorrow, a darkness that festers in the heart of this house. It is a hunger, an insatiable need that feeds on our guilt, our fear, our very souls. She is its prisoner, and I am its witness, bound to watch as it consumes us, piece by piece. Edgar closed the book, his heart pounding in his chest. The words felt like a warning, a glimpse into the fate that awaited him if he stayed. He could feel the house around him, alive and watching, waiting for him to give in to its pull. At the lake, the sun was setting by the time Edgar made his way outside, his footsteps carrying him toward the lake. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the still dark waters that stretched out before him, their surface smooth as glass. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves, a faint reminder of the life that had once thrived here. He reached the edge of the lake, staring out at the water, his mind filled with images of the woman from his dreams, her hollow eyes gazing back at him from the depths. He could almost see her, standing just beneath the surface, her figure distorted by the water, her face twisted in a silent scream. A sudden chill swept over him, and he felt the weight of her presence, a cold, oppressive force that pressed down on him, filling his mind with a despair that felt like it would crush him. He took a step back, feeling a strange compulsion to run, to leave this place, and never look back. But as he turned, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. There, at the water's edge, was a small, weathered stone, half buried in the mud. It was a gravestone, its surface worn and cracked, the name barely visible in the fading light. Isabella Gray. The name sent a shock through him, a jolt of recognition that he couldn't explain. He had never known an Isabella, yet the name felt familiar, as though it were a part of him, a memory buried deep within his mind. He knelt down, tracing his fingers over the letters, feeling the cold stone beneath his skin. A faint whisper filled his ears, a soft, mournful voice that seemed to rise from the depths of the lake. Remember. The word echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of the secrets he had uncovered, the dark history that bound him to this place. He felt a strange connection to Isabella, a sense of responsibility, as though he were the only one who could help her find peace. But as he stood, the whisper faded, replaced by a silence so deep, it felt as though the world had been swallowed whole. The Hollow Eyes. That night, Edgar lay awake in bed, his mind filled with thoughts of Isabella, of the sorrow that filled her hollow eyes. He felt as though he were drowning in her grief, pulled under by a darkness that he could not escape. He could feel her presence in the room, a cold, oppressive force that pressed down on him, filling his mind with a sense of despair that felt like it would consume him. As he drifted into sleep, he found himself standing by the lake, the fog swirling around him, the water dark and still. He could see her figure in the distance, her form barely visible through the mist, her eyes hollow and empty, filled with a sorrow that cut through him like a knife. She reached out to him, her hand trembling, her voice a whisper that seemed to seep into his very soul. "Help me!" Edgar felt himself drawn to her, pulled forward by a force he could not resist. He reached out, his hand brushing hers, feeling the cold, clammy skin beneath his fingers. And in that moment, he saw it all. The life she had lived, the love she had lost, the betrayal that had bound her to this place, trapped her in an endless cycle of despair and longing. He could feel her pain, her anger, her sorrow, each emotion crashing over him like a wave, filling him with a darkness that felt like it would consume him. As he opened his eyes, he found himself back in his room, his hands still outstretched, as though he were reaching for someone who wasn't there. The room was silent, the air thick with the scent of decay, a faint reminder of the death that lingered in every corner of the house. But in his mind, he could still see her face, her hollow eyes staring back at him, filled with a sorrow that would never fade. And he knew, with a cold, unshakable certainty, that he was bound to her, just as Lawrence had been bound, trapped in a web of guilt and sorrow that stretched across time, binding them all to this place, this house, this cursed lake. The hollow eyes watched him from the shadows, waiting, always waiting. Chapter 4. Shattered Reflections. The night held an unnerving stillness, broken only by the faint creaks and groans of the old house settling around Edgar, as though it were alive, breathing in the darkness. He lay in bed, his eyes open, wide and unblinking, his mind racing with fragments of his encounters with Isabella, and the strange echoing plea from the lake's depths. Each whisper felt like a tightening noose, and every silence seemed to hold an impending doom that slithered through the halls, watching, waiting. When sleep finally claimed him, it was filled with twisting visions, a dark corridor stretching endlessly before him, lined with mirrors that flickered with scenes of his past, distorted images that blurred into one another. He saw himself as a boy, running through an empty field, his reflection distorted in a stream. He saw glimpses of Lawrence's life, scenes of anguish and guilt, layered with shadows of Isabella's hollow-eyed stare. Edgar awoke, drenched in sweat, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. He sat up, and his gaze fell on the mirror at the foot of his bed. In the moonlight streaming through the window, the mirror's surface looked fractured, a dark spiderweb of cracks that hadn't been there the night before. He stared at his own reflection, the familiar features he had seen countless times now twisted and marred by the shattered glass. But then he noticed something else, someone else. There, just beyond his own reflection, was the faint outline of a figure, blurred and almost invisible, her hollow eyes barely visible through the cracks. A shiver crept up his spine as he blinked, the figure vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. He stumbled out of bed, his hands cold and trembling, his mind racing with thoughts of the woman, of Isabella, of her sorrowful gaze that seemed to penetrate through the walls of the house, reaching out to him from the shadows. The Hall of Mirrors. Haunted by the vision, Edgar found himself compelled to explore the house further. The following morning, he wandered the hallways, moving deeper into the house than he ever had before. He passed rooms filled with dusty furniture, the air thick with the scent of mold and decay, every step accompanied by the faint creaks of the floorboards underfoot. The house seemed larger, as though the halls had stretched in the night, growing new doorways and rooms that hadn't been there before. At the end of one hallway, he discovered a door that he couldn't remember seeing before. It was slightly ajar, revealing a room bathed in an eerie half-light. His hand trembled as he pushed the door open, stepping into what could only be described as a gallery of mirrors. Every wall was lined with mirrors of various shapes and sizes, their surfaces clouded with dust, their frames ornate and twisted like the branches of ancient trees. He moved deeper into the room, his reflection multiplied countless times, his image fracturing and distorting in each mirror, as though each reflection held a different version of himself, each one slightly twisted, slightly wrong. In one mirror, his face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow, much like Isabella's. In another, He looked as though he were screaming, his mouth open wide in silent agony. The images flickered and shifted, each reflection revealing a version of himself trapped in some nightmarish tableau. A sense of dread filled him as he reached the center of the room. The air felt thick, heavy, as though he were breathing in water instead of air. And then he saw it. Her reflection, standing just behind him, her face barely visible in the mirror's surface. He turned, but there was no one there, only the empty room and the suffocating silence. The whisper returned, faint and distant, drifting through the room like a cold breeze. "Remember!" The words seemed to echo in each mirror, the sound layering over itself, growing louder and louder, until it was all he could hear, filling his mind with a cacophony of whispers. He stumbled back, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the wall, but his fingers brushed against something cold, wet, something that felt like water. He looked down, and to his horror, he saw that his reflection was now standing ankle-deep in dark water, the surface rippling as though something were moving just beneath. But when he looked at the floor around him, there was nothing, just the dusty wooden boards of the old house. His reflection continued to change, his own face replaced by that of Lawrence, his features twisted with anguish and guilt. Then by Isabella's hollow-eyed gaze, her face filled with a sorrow that seemed to pierce through him. Edgar turned and fled from the room, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence, the whisper following him, haunting him. "Ram, Mav, the portrait gallery." By midday, Edgar's nerves were raw, his mind a blur of confusion and dread. He paced through the house, his footsteps carrying him to another wing he had yet to explore. He entered a long corridor lined with portraits, each one more disturbing than the last. The faces stared down at him, their expressions twisted with fear, anger, sorrow, and something darker, a sense of knowing, as though they were all privy to some terrible secret he had yet to uncover. At the far end of the hall was a large portrait, its frame carved with intricate symbols that seemed to shift and change under his gaze. The figure in the portrait was a woman with hollow eyes, her face obscured by shadows, her hand reaching out as though beckoning him closer. Edgar felt a strange compulsion to reach out, to touch the portrait, to feel the rough texture of the paint beneath his fingers. As his hand brushed the surface, a shock ran through him, filling his mind with visions, memories that weren't his own, memories filled with sorrow, betrayal, and a desperate longing for release. The visions came in fragments, flashes of moments long gone, a woman standing by the lake, her face twisted in sorrow, her eyes hollow and empty, a man standing behind her, his face obscured, his hand reaching out to push her forward. The splash of water, the silence that followed, and then the hollow-eyed stare that seemed to reach out from the depths, lingering, waiting. Edgar stumbled back, his mind reeling with the weight of the memories. He could feel her sorrow, her anger, her desperate need for justice. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was a part of her story, bound to her by the same darkness that had claimed her life. At the descent into madness. Over the following days, Edgar's grip on reality began to slip. Shadows moved at the edge of his vision, whispering secrets that he couldn't quite hear. Mirrors reflected images that weren't there, faces twisted in expressions of agony and fear. The house seemed to close in around him, the walls shifting and changing, creating new rooms and corridors that hadn't existed before. The nights were the worst, filled with visions of the lake, of Isabella's hollow-eyed stare, her sorrowful gaze watching him from the shadows. He began to hear her voice more clearly, each word dripping with sorrow and anger, each plea a dagger that twisted in his mind. "Help me." The words echoed through his dreams, filling his mind with images of the lake, of the darkness that lay beneath the surface, waiting, watching. He felt a strange compulsion to go to the lake, to find her, to release her from the chains that bound her. But with each step he took, he felt the darkness growing stronger, wrapping around him like a shroud, pulling him deeper into its embrace. The house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, feeding off his fear, his guilt, his sorrow. The final reflection. On the seventh night, Edgar found himself back in the Hall of Mirrors, his reflection fractured and distorted, each image revealing a different version of himself, each one more twisted than the last. He could see Lawrence's face staring back at him from one mirror, Isabella's hollow-eyed gaze from another, their faces blending together in a nightmarish tableau. And then, in the mirror at the center of the room, he saw himself as he truly was. Pale, gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow, filled with the same sorrow that had haunted Isabella, the same guilt that had consumed Lawrence. The whisper returned, louder this time, filling the room with a chorus of voices, each one pleading, begging for release. "Help us!" Edgar felt a strange calm wash over him, a sense of acceptance as he stared into the mirror, his own hollow-eyed gaze staring back at him. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, the sorrow and anger that had bound so many to this place. He reached out, his hand brushing against the cold glass, and in that moment, he understood. He was not just a victim of the house's curse. He was a part of it, bound to its secrets, its darkness, its endless cycle of sorrow and despair. The house had claimed him, just as it had claimed Isabella, Lawrence, and countless others before him. And as he stared into the mirror, he saw his own reflection dissolve, replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of the woman by the lake, her sorrowful gaze watching him from the depths of the darkness. And in that moment, Edgar knew that he would never leave, that he was bound to this place, to its secrets, its horrors, its endless shadows. For he was now a part of the house, a reflection in its dark, twisted mirrors, a hollow-eyed ghost trapped within its walls, forever waiting, forever watching. And from the shadows, the hollow eyes stared back, filled with a sorrow that would never fade, a despair that would never end. Chapter 6. The Mirror Lake. The fog lay thick and unyielding over the lake, so dense that it was difficult to tell where the shore ended and the water began. Edgar stood at the edge, his gaze fixed on the dark, unmoving surface, a veil of silence heavy in the air. He had been drawn here by a force he could not explain, a compulsion as powerful as it was unnerving. It was as if the house itself had whispered to him, urging him to seek the truth hidden beneath the lake's surface. Over the past days he had been haunted by visions of the child with hollow eyes, and by whispers that seemed to echo through the very walls. Each night, he found himself tangled in the house's dark secrets, trapped in a twisted nightmare that blurred the line between reality and hallucination. The presence of the lake and its shadowy depths gnawed at him, filling his mind with dread and questions he could not shake. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight, he felt that the lake held an answer, a dark, terrible answer that he both feared and desperately needed. Weinkorb, the voice beneath Edgar, knelt at the edge of the lake, his fingers skimming the water's surface. The air was thick and cold, each breath sending chills down his spine. He leaned in closer, staring down at his reflection, only to see it twist and warp, his own face replaced by the hollow-eyed gaze of the child. He stumbled back, his heart racing, but the vision didn't leave him. Instead, it grew stronger, more insistent, until he felt the unmistakable urge to wade into the water, to go deeper, to uncover whatever lay beneath. As he took his first step into the lake, the water was colder than he could have imagined, seeping through his clothes, chilling him to the bone. The fog wrapped around him, thick and oppressive, pressing down on him like a shroud as he moved deeper, each step sending ripples across the still surface. Then, faintly at first, he heard it, the voice. It was soft, muffled, as if it were calling from beneath the water, a mournful cry that was both childlike and ancient, filled with a sorrow that tore at his heart. "Help me." The words seemed to echo through the lake, rising from the depths, filling the air with a haunting melody. Edgar froze, his breath catching as the voice grew louder, filling his mind with images of the child, of her hollow eyes and sorrowful gaze, her small, delicate hand reaching out to him from the darkness. He moved forward, his feet sinking into the muddy bottom of the lake, each step drawing him closer to the voice, to the source of the sorrow that bound him to this place. The water was up to his chest now, icy and unrelenting, numbing his limbs. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. And then, as he reached the center of the lake, he saw it. a faint light shimmering beneath the surface, a soft, pulsing glow that beckoned him forward, filling his mind with a strange, unnatural calm. The voice grew louder, more insistent, its words blurring together in a sorrowful litany that filled him with a despair so deep it felt as though he were drowning in it. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he plunged beneath the water, the world around him fading into darkness. At the realm below, the water was colder than he could have imagined, wrapping around him like a shroud, pressing down on him from all sides. His vision blurred, and he felt the weight of the lake bearing down on him, pulling him deeper, deeper, until he was lost in the darkness. But then, through the murky depths, he saw her, the child with hollow eyes, her figure floating just beyond his reach, her face twisted in sorrow, her small hand reaching out to him. She was surrounded by a soft, ethereal glow, her body barely visible through the dark water, as though she were made of shadows and light. He reached out, his fingers brushing hers, and in that moment, he was filled with a rush of memories, images and emotions that weren't his own, memories of a life long gone, a life filled with sorrow, betrayal, and a longing for release. He saw glimpses of the house as it once was, grand and beautiful, filled with laughter and light. He saw a woman standing by the lake, her eyes filled with sadness as she gazed out at the water, her figure bathed in moonlight. He saw a man standing behind her, his face obscured by shadows, his hand reaching out to push her forward. And then he saw the child, her small figure curled up on the floor, her face hidden in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she wept. He could feel her sorrow, her fear, her desperate need for comfort, for someone to save her from the darkness that had claimed her. The memories overwhelmed him, filling his mind with a sorrow so deep it felt as though his heart were breaking. He could feel the weight of her despair, the darkness that had bound her to the lake, to the house, to the endless cycle of fear and sorrow that had claimed so many before him. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the vision faded, leaving him alone in the darkness, the child's sorrowful gaze lingering in his mind, her voice a haunting whisper that echoed through his soul. "Help me?" At the return to shore, Edgar surfaced with a gasp, the cold air filling his lungs as he stumbled back to the shore, his body numb, his mind reeling from the vision. He collapsed onto the ground, his breath ragged, his heart pounding as he tried to make sense of what he had seen. He could still feel the weight of the child's sorrow, her desperate plea for release, and he knew with a sickening certainty that he was bound to her fate, caught in the same web of sorrow and despair that had trapped so many others before him. The lake had shown him the truth, a glimpse into the darkness that lay at the heart of the house, the darkness that had claimed Isabella, Lawrence, and now, him. He could feel its pull, the weight of its secrets pressing down on him, filling his mind with a despair that felt as though it would consume him. But he couldn't turn away, not now. The child's sorrowful gaze lingered in his mind, her hollow eyes filled with a sorrow that would never fade, and he knew that he couldn't leave, not until he had found a way to release her from the darkness that bound her. The blood-red moon. That night, Edgar sat by the window, his gaze fixed on the lake, the fog swirling across its surface like ghostly fingers. The moon hung low in the sky, its light a deep blood red that cast an eerie glow over the landscape, filling the air with a sense of impending doom. As he watched, he felt the pull of the lake once more, a compulsion that gnawed at him, urging him to return, to seek out the child, to uncover the secrets that lay hidden beneath the surface. The voice echoed in his mind, a faint whisper that filled him with a sorrow so deep it felt as though his heart would shatter. "Help me!" The words haunted him, filling his mind with images of the child, her hollow eyes staring back at him from the shadows, her small hand reaching out to him, begging for release. He could feel her sorrow, her fear, her desperate need for comfort, for someone to save her from the darkness that had claimed her. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was the only one who could help her, the only one who could release her from the chains that bound her to the lake, to the house, to the endless cycle of sorrow and despair that had claimed so many before him. The descent. Driven by a compulsion he couldn't resist, Edgar returned to the lake, his heart pounding as he waded into the water, the cold seeping into his bones, filling his mind with a numbness that was both comforting and terrifying. He took a deep breath, plunging beneath the surface, his body sinking into the darkness, the water wrapping around him like a shroud, pressing down on him, pulling him deeper, deeper, until he was lost in the shadows. Through the murky depths, he saw her once more. The child with hollow eyes, her small figure floating just beyond his reach, her face twisted in sorrow, her small hand reaching out to him. She was surrounded by a soft, ethereal glow, her body barely visible through the dark water, as though she were made of shadows and light. He reached out, his fingers brushing hers, and in that moment, he felt a rush of memories, images and emotions that weren't his own. Memories of a life long gone, a life filled with sorrow, betrayal, and a longing for release. The visions flooded his mind, filling him with a sorrow so deep it felt as though his heart were breaking. He could feel her despair, her fear, her desperate need for comfort, for someone to save her from the darkness that had claimed her. And in that moment, he understood. The child was not just a spirit bound to the lake. She was a part of him, a reflection of his own sorrow, his own guilt, his own endless longing for release. As the vision faded, he found himself back on the shore, the child's sorrowful gaze lingering in his mind, her hollow eyes filled with a despair that would never fade. The lake had shown him the truth, a glimpse into the darkness that lay at the heart of the house, the darkness that had claimed so many before him. And he knew with a cold certainty that he was bound to its secrets, its horrors, its endless shadows, for he was now a part of the house, a reflection in its dark, twisted mirrors, a hollow-eyed ghost trapped within its walls, forever waiting, forever watching. And from the shadows, the hollow eyes stared back, filled with a sorrow that would never fade, a despair that would never end. Chapter 7. Whispers of Betrayal. Edgar returned to the house, dripping wet, his clothes clinging to his skin and his mind reeling with the memories that had flooded his thoughts beneath the lake. He felt hollow, as though the lake had taken a piece of him with it, leaving only a shadow of who he had once been. The child's sorrowful gaze haunted him, her whisper a constant murmur in his mind, filling him with a grief so deep it felt as though his heart had been torn open. Each step back toward the house felt heavier, as though invisible hands were pulling him down, dragging him deeper into the darkness that filled every corner of the place. He knew now that he was connected to the child, to the house, to the lake, and to something darker, something far older than he could understand. The hallway of shadows. As he walked through the front door, the house seemed different, colder, darker. The shadows had grown longer, stretching across the floor like reaching fingers, twisting and writhing in unnatural shapes that filled him with a deep, gut-wrenching fear. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, a silence that felt alive, pressing down on him, surrounding him with a sense of anticipation, as though the house were holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold. He moved down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the stillness, each step carrying him deeper into the heart of the house, where the darkness seemed to throb with a life of its own. The walls were lined with portraits, faces of past occupants, their expressions twisted in fear, their eyes filled with a knowledge that made his skin crawl. At the end of the hall was a portrait he hadn't seen before. It was larger than the others, its frame dark and ornate, carved with intricate symbols that seemed to shift and writhe as he stared at them. The figure in the portrait was a woman, her face obscured by shadows, her eyes hollow and empty, filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to seep from the canvas, wrapping around him like a shroud. As he stared, he felt a strange familiarity, a sense of recognition that sent a chill down his spine. It was Isabella. He was certain of it, even though he had never truly seen her face. Her hollow eyes seemed to watch him, filled with an accusation that made his skin crawl, as though she were blaming him for something he couldn't remember, some sin he had committed without knowing. A whisper filled the air, soft and haunting, drifting through the silence like a ghostly breeze. "Remember." The word echoed in his mind, filling him with a sense of dread so deep it felt as though his heart would stop. He reached out, his fingers brushing the surface of the portrait, and in that moment, the house seemed to come alive, the walls pulsing with a dark energy that sent shivers through his entire body. Maz Zagandri, the secret staircase. As his hand touched the portrait, he felt a slight shift in the wall, a hidden panel that slid open, revealing a narrow, winding staircase descending into darkness. The air that drifted up from below was thick and stale, filled with the scent of mildew and decay, as though it hadn't been disturbed in decades. Without thinking, Edgar stepped into the passage, his heart pounding as he descended the staircase, the shadows closing in around him, filling his mind with a sense of impending doom. Each step creaked beneath his weight, the sound echoing through the darkness, growing louder and louder until it was all he could hear. At the bottom of the staircase, he found himself in a small, dark room lined with shelves filled with old, tattered books and papers. The walls were covered in strange symbols, each one etched deep into the stone, filling the room with a sense of dark power that made his skin crawl. In the center of the room was a table, its surface covered in dust, and on it lay an open journal, its pages filled with cramped, uneven handwriting that seemed to leap off the page with a frantic energy. Edgar picked up the journal, his hands trembling as he began to read, each word filling him with a deeper sense of dread. They think I don't know, but I can see it in their eyes. The lies, the deceit, the whispers that fill the halls. They are all against me, every one of them, conspiring in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. But I won't let them take what's mine. This house is mine, my legacy, my life's work. They won't take it from me. The words were filled with a desperation that felt all too familiar, a frantic need to hold on to something that was slipping away. Edgar turned the page, each line drawing him deeper into the writer's madness. I see her by the lake, her eyes hollow, filled with sorrow, with anger. She watches me, her gaze a constant reminder of what I've done. But it wasn't my fault. She made me do it. She drove me to it. Her lies, her betrayal. She betrayed me, and now she is trapped, bound to this place, a prisoner of her own making. Edgar felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he read the final lines. The words scrawled in a hand that was barely legible, filled with a frantic energy that seemed to leap off the page. I see her every night, her hollow eyes staring back at me, filled with a sorrow that will never fade. She haunts me, her voice a constant whisper, begging for release. But I can't give it to her. She deserves this. She deserves to suffer for what she did to me. The journal slipped from his hands, landing on the table with a soft thud, the final words echoing in his mind, filling him with a horror so deep it felt as though he would never escape it. Elatomui, of the betrayal. Edgar stood in the dark room, his mind reeling as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The woman by the lake, Isabella, had been betrayed, cast into the lake by someone she had trusted, someone who had loved her. The sorrow that filled her hollow eyes was not just the sorrow of death, but the sorrow of betrayal, of a life stolen, a future ripped away by someone who had once held her heart. He could feel her presence in the room, a cold, oppressive force that pressed down on him, filling his mind with images of her final moments, the darkness closing in around her, the water filling her lungs, her heart breaking as she realized what had been done to her. And then he saw the child, her small figure standing at the edge of the lake, her hollow eyes filled with the same sorrow, the same anger, the same despair. She had watched it happen, had seen her mother taken from her, cast into the darkness by a man she had trusted, a man who had betrayed them both. Edgar felt a surge of anger, a burning rage that filled his entire being, a need for justice, for revenge, for release. The sorrow that had weighed him down, that had filled his mind with despair, transformed into a fury so intense it felt as though it would consume him. He could hear Isabella's voice in his mind, her whisper a constant reminder of the betrayal, of the sorrow that had bound her to this place, to the house, to the lake. Help me! The words filled him with a sense of purpose, a need to set things right, to break the chains that bound her, that bound him, to this place. He knew now that he was the only one who could free her, the only one who could release her from the darkness that held her captive. Pact. As he stood in the dark room, his mind filled with the memories of Isabella, of the child, of the sorrow and betrayal that had claimed their lives, he felt a strange, dark power rise within him, a power that filled him with a sense of purpose, a need to finish what had been started. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the strange symbols carved into the walls, feeling the dark energy that pulsed beneath his fingertips, filling his mind with visions of the past, of the horrors that had unfolded within these walls. He could see the man who had betrayed Isabella, his face twisted in anger, his hands shaking as he cast her into the lake, his eyes filled with a hatred that made Edgar's skin crawl. And he could see the child, her small figure watching from the shadows, her hollow eyes filled with a sorrow that would haunt her forever. And then he saw himself, his own face reflected in the dark waters of the lake, his hollow eyes filled with the same sorrow, the same anger, the same need for release. In that moment, he understood. He was bound to them, to Isabella, to the child, to the house, by a bond that could never be broken, a bond forged in sorrow and betrayal, a bond that would bind him to this place forever. He could feel Isabella's presence beside him, her cold hand resting on his shoulder, her hollow eyes watching him, filled with a sorrow that would never fade. And he knew, with a cold certainty, that he would do whatever it took to release her, to break the chains that bound them, to bring an end to the sorrow that had claimed them all. He would finish what had been started, for he was bound to the house, to the lake, to the darkness that lay within its depths. And from the shadows, the hollow eyes stared back, filled with a sorrow that would never fade, a despair that would never end. Chapter 8. The Night of Reckoning. The house seemed alive that night, vibrating with a dark energy that pulsed through the walls, filling the air with a sense of anticipation. Every shadow stretched long and deep, twisting into forms that seemed to reach out, as if they wanted to pull Edgar into their dark embrace. The oppressive silence that hung over the place had been replaced by whispers, soft, indistinct voices that seemed to drift from every corner, every crack, filling his mind with an eerie chorus that made his skin crawl. Edgar knew what he had to do. The bond he had felt, the strange, undeniable connection to Isabella, the child, and the house itself, had grown into something beyond his understanding, something dark and binding. But there was a purpose to it, an unspoken task that had been passed down to him from the spirits that haunted these walls. Isabella's hollow gaze still haunted him, her sorrowful eyes a constant reminder of the betrayal she had suffered, the life stolen from her, the injustice that had bound her to the lake, to the house, to an eternity of darkness. And tonight, he would face that darkness. Tonight, he would confront the force that held them all captive. The Gathering of Shadows. As the night deepened, Edgar moved through the house with a sense of purpose, guided by a pull he could not resist. The walls seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing thicker, darker, filled with shapes that writhed and twisted like living things. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of voices that filled his mind with fragments of Isabella's final moments, the betrayal that had led her to her watery grave, the sorrow that had chained her to this place. He felt her presence beside him as he made his way through the darkened halls, her cold hand brushing against his arm, guiding him forward. She was leading him to something, some hidden secret that lay buried within the house, a truth that had been concealed by layers of time and darkness. As he approached the grand staircase, he saw them, shadows gathering at the top of the stairs, their forms indistinct and blurred, as though they were caught between worlds. They stood in silence, their hollow eyes watching him with an intensity that made his blood run cold, their presence filling him with a sense of dread so deep it felt as though his heart might stop. The shadows parted as he ascended the stairs, their forms shifting to make way for him, their eyes following his every move. He could feel their sorrow, their anger, their despair, emotions so intense they seemed to seep into his very soul, filling him with a darkness that threatened to consume him. At the top of the stairs, he found himself facing a door he had never seen before, a large, heavy door covered in symbols that pulsed with a dark energy, symbols that seemed to writhe and twist beneath his gaze, as though they were alive. He felt a strange compulsion to reach out, to touch the door, to open it, and confront whatever lay beyond. The Chamber of Secrets. Edgar pushed the door open, stepping into a room that felt colder than ice, the air thick with a musty odor that filled his lungs with each breath. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single candle on a small table in the center, its flame flickering as though it struggled to survive in the oppressive darkness. Around the table, 4 figures stood, their faces hidden by dark hoods, their forms shrouded in shadow. Edgar could sense the power radiating from them, a dark, malevolent energy that filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread. One of the figures stepped forward, lowering its hood to reveal a face Edgar recognized instantly. It was the man from the lake, the betrayer, the one who had cast Isabella into the water, condemning her to an eternity of sorrow and despair. The man's face was twisted with guilt and fear, his eyes hollow and empty, filled with a sorrow that mirrored Isabella's, a sorrow that would never fade. He spoke in a low, trembling voice, his words barely more than a whisper. "I thought I could escape her," he said, his voice filled with despair. "I thought I could leave her behind, that the lake would silence her, but she haunts me still. She haunts us all." The other figures lowered their hoods, revealing faces that were equally twisted, equally hollow, their eyes filled with the same sorrow, the same despair. They were all bound to her, bound to the house, to the lake, to the darkness that had claimed them. Edgar felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the truth. They were trapped here, condemned to haunt this place for eternity, bound by their betrayal, by the sorrow and guilt that had consumed them. He could feel Isabella's presence in the room, her sorrowful gaze filling his mind, her voice a faint whisper that echoed in his thoughts. "Help me." Her words filled him with a sense of purpose, a need to break the chains that bound them all, to release them from the darkness that held them captive. Ethan, and the ritual of redemption. The man reached out, placing a cold, trembling hand on Edgar's shoulder, his hollow eyes filled with a desperate plea. "There is a way," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "A way to end this, to release her, to free us all. But it comes at a cost." Edgar nodded, feeling a strange calm wash over him, a sense of acceptance that settled deep within his soul. He was ready to pay the price, whatever it was, to end the suffering, to bring peace to Isabella, to the child, to the house, to himself. The man gestured to the table, where a small black book lay open, its pages filled with symbols and incantations that seemed to pulse with a dark energy, symbols that Edgar recognized from the walls of the hidden room, from the lake, from the very walls of the house itself. The man began to chant, his voice low and steady, the words filling the room with a dark, oppressive energy that made Edgar's skin crawl. The other figures joined in, their voices merging into a haunting melody that filled the air with a sense of foreboding, a sense of finality. Edgar closed his eyes, allowing the darkness to wash over him, feeling it seep into his skin, into his bones, filling him with a cold, numbing sensation that dulled his senses, his fears, his pain. He could feel Isabella's presence beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, her hollow eyes watching him, filled with a sorrow that would never fade. The chanting grew louder, more intense, the words blending together into a cacophony of sound that filled his mind, drowning out his thoughts, his fears, his very sense of self. He felt as though he were being pulled apart, his soul unraveling, merging with the darkness that filled the room, becoming one with the shadows. And then, in a moment of blinding clarity, he understood. The house, the lake, the sorrow, the betrayal. It was all connected, all part of a cycle that had been repeating for generations, a cycle of pain and despair that had bound them all to this place, to the darkness that lay within its walls. He could see Isabella's final moments, the betrayal that had shattered her, the sorrow that had bound her to the lake, to the house, to him. He could feel her despair, her anger, her longing for release, for peace, for an end to the suffering that had consumed her. And he knew, with a certainty that filled his soul, that he was the only one who could end it, the only one who could break the cycle to set them free. The sacrifice. As the chanting reached its peak, Edgar felt a surge of energy fill him, a dark, powerful force that pulsed through his veins, filling him with a strength he had never known. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting Isabella's, her hollow eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it felt as though it would consume him. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched her face, feeling the coldness of her skin, the weight of her sorrow, her anger, her despair. He could feel her longing for release, for peace, for an end to the suffering that had bound her to this place. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice filled with a determination he hadn't known he possessed. "I will end this. I will free you." Isabella's gaze softened, her hollow eyes filling with a faint glimmer of hope, a light that pierced through the darkness, filling the room with a sense of peace, of calm, of acceptance. Edgar took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he prepared himself for the final act, the sacrifice that would break the chains that bound them all, that would release Isabella, the child, the shadows, from the endless cycle of sorrow and despair. The man placed his hand on Edgar's shoulder, his hollow eyes filled with gratitude, with relief, with a sorrow that would never fade. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible, a faint echo that filled the room with a sense of finality, of peace. Edgar closed his eyes, feeling the darkness wash over him, filling his mind with images of Isabella, of the child, of the lake, of the house, of the sorrow and betrayal that had bound them all. And then, with a final blinding surge of energy, he felt the chains break, the darkness lift, the sorrow dissipate, leaving only silence, only peace. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting Isabella's one last time, her hollow eyes filled with a warmth, a light that had never been there before. And as he watched, she faded, her figure dissolving into the air, leaving only a faint whisper, a final sorrowful goodbye. "Thank you." Edgar felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a sense of peace filling his soul, a peace he had never known, a peace that filled him with a warmth, a light, a hope. The shadows faded, the darkness lifted, leaving only the house, silent and still, its secrets finally laid to rest. And in the silence, Edgar felt a sense of peace, a peace that would never fade, a peace that would never end. Chapter 9. The Truth. Beneath the house was quiet. A heavy, unearthly silence pressed down on everything, filling each room and corridor with an emptiness that felt as ancient as the walls themselves. Edgar stood in the dim light of dawn, the first pale rays filtering through the dust-covered windows. For the first time in days, he felt a strange calm settle over him, as though the house itself were resting, its dark energy temporarily subdued. But Edgar knew it was not over. He felt it in his bones, in the air around him. There was still one final secret hidden within these walls, a truth that had eluded him, buried deep beneath layers of time and shadow. The ritual, the sacrifice, had lifted the immediate darkness, but it had not erased it. The curse had been broken, but the scars remained, binding Edgar to the house as tightly as ever. He understood, with a dreadful certainty, that he was now part of its story. The descent into the depths, driven by a compulsion he could not explain, Edgar found himself moving deeper into the house, drawn toward the basement door that he had only glimpsed before. Now it beckoned to him with a strange allure, like an invitation whispered through the walls. The air grew colder with each step, the silence deepening, pressing in on him like a shroud. He reached the basement door, his hand hesitating on the knob. The wood felt cool under his fingers, and as he turned it, a sense of foreboding filled him. He stepped inside, descending the narrow, winding staircase that spiraled down into the earth, each step taking him further from the light, deeper into the darkness that lay hidden beneath the house. The basement was vast, far larger than he had expected, with walls of rough stone and a ceiling that loomed high above him, lost in shadow. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay, a faint, damp scent that seeped into his lungs, filling him with a deep, unexplainable dread. In the center of the room lay a single, unmarked grave, the soil undisturbed, as though it had been carefully preserved for all these years. Edgar's heart raced as he approached, the sense of familiarity overwhelming him, filling his mind with flashes of memories he couldn't place. He could see a figure standing over the grave, her hollow eyes filled with sorrow, her hand reaching out as though to touch something or someone. He knelt beside the grave, his fingers digging into the earth, feeling the cold soil beneath his skin. He could feel a presence there, something ancient and restless, a memory that had been buried with the body that lay beneath. It was as though the grave held the house's final secret, a truth that had been hidden from him, waiting for him to uncover it. As he continued to dig, he felt something hard beneath his fingers, a small, tarnished locket, its surface dark with age. He held it in his hand, feeling its weight, its coldness, as though it held a piece of the darkness that had haunted the house for so long. The locket's secret. Edgar wiped away the dirt, revealing a faint inscription on the locket's surface. The words were worn, barely legible, but he could make out the name, Isabella. His hands trembled as he opened it, revealing a small, faded photograph inside. A young woman with sorrowful eyes, her face filled with a haunting beauty that was both familiar and strange. He could see the pain in her expression, a sadness that mirrored the sorrow he had felt within these walls, the sorrow that had bound her to this place, to him. The memories returned in a flood, filling his mind with images of her final moments, the betrayal, the despair, the dark waters closing in around her. He could feel her sorrow, her anger, her longing for release, emotions so intense they seemed to sear his very soul. But there was something else, another memory hidden within the locket, a memory that had been waiting for him, a final piece of the puzzle that would reveal the truth. As he stared at the photograph, he felt a presence beside him, a figure standing in the darkness, her hollow eyes watching him, filled with a sorrow that would never fade. "I was never alone," she whispered, her voice barely audible, filled with a sadness that echoed through the room. "I had a daughter." The realization struck him like a blow, a sudden, terrible understanding that filled him with horror. The child, the small figure with hollow eyes, the voice that had haunted him, the presence that had lingered in the shadows. It had been Isabella's daughter, bound to the house by the same sorrow, the same betrayal that had claimed her mother. He could feel the weight of their grief, their anger, their longing for justice, emotions that had seeped into the very walls of the house, binding them all to this place, to an endless cycle of sorrow and despair. And now he understood his own role, his own connection to this tragedy. He was not just a bystander, a victim of the house's curse. He was part of it, bound to Isabella and her daughter by a thread of fate that had woven their lives together, intertwining their souls, binding them to the darkness that lay beneath the house. The shadow's testimony. The basement grew colder, the air thickening as shadows gathered around him, their hollow eyes filled with sorrow, their faces twisted in expressions of grief and anger. They were the spirits of those who had come before him, bound to the house by the same curse, the same betrayal that had claimed Isabella and her daughter. They watched him in silence, their presence filling him with a dread so deep it felt as though his heart would stop. He could feel their emotions, their sorrow and despair, emotions that had been suppressed for generations, waiting for someone to hear their story, to understand their pain. One of the figures stepped forward, his face shrouded in darkness, his voice a hollow whisper that echoed through the room. "We are all bound here," he said, his words filled with a sorrow that made Edgar's chest tighten. "Bound by the sins of those who betrayed us, by the darkness that has consumed this house for centuries." Another figure spoke, her voice filled with anger, her eyes hollow and empty. "They thought they could escape it, that they could bury their secrets and walk away. But the house remembers, the lake remembers, and we remember." The figures began to chant, their voices blending into a haunting melody that filled the room with a sense of sorrow, a grief so intense it felt as though it would crush him. Edgar closed his eyes, letting the voices wash over him, feeling their pain, their anger, their longing for release. He could feel the weight of their emotions, emotions that had been suppressed for generations, emotions that had seeped into the walls of the house, filling it with a darkness that had bound them all. The reckoning. As the chanting grew louder, Edgar felt a surge of energy fill him, a dark power that pulsed through his veins, filling him with a strength he had never known. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting Isabella's. Her hollow eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it felt as though it would consume him. The spirits gathered around him, their faces twisted in sorrow, in anger, in grief, emotions so intense they seemed to vibrate with a life of their own. He could feel their presence, their longing for release, for justice, for an end to the suffering that had bound them to this place. And he knew, with a certainty that filled his soul, that he was the only one who could break the cycle, to release them from the darkness that held them captive. Edgar knelt beside the grave, clutching the locket in his hand, his mind filled with memories of Isabella, of her daughter, of the sorrow and betrayal that had claimed their lives. He could feel their emotions, their pain, their anger, emotions that had seeped into the very fabric of the house, binding them all to this place, to an endless cycle of sorrow and despair. The chanting reached a fever pitch, filling the room with a sense of anticipation, of finality, of release. Edgar closed his eyes, feeling the energy building within him, a dark, powerful force that pulsed through his veins, filling him with a strength he had never known. And then, with a final, blinding surge of energy, he felt the chains break, the darkness lift, the sorrow dissipate, leaving only silence, only peace. The aftermath. When Edgar opened his eyes, the basement was empty, the spirits gone, their presence faded into the shadows, leaving only a faint echo of their sorrow, a lingering memory of the darkness that had bound them to this place. He stood slowly, his body weak, his mind filled with a sense of peace, of acceptance, a calm that filled him with a warmth he had never known. He made his way back up the staircase, the house silent around him, its dark energy subdued, the weight of its secrets finally laid to rest. The shadows were gone, the whispers silenced, leaving only the stillness of the dawn, the soft light filtering through the windows, filling the rooms with a quiet beauty that felt like a blessing. Edgar stepped outside, the fresh air filling his lungs, the warmth of the sun on his face, a reminder of the life that lay beyond the house, a life that was finally his to live. As he walked away, he felt the weight of the house's secrets lift from his shoulders, the sorrow and despair that had bound him to its walls finally dissipating, leaving only a sense of peace, of freedom, a peace that would never fade, a peace that would never end. And as he left, he knew, with a certainty that filled his soul, that Isabella, her daughter, and the spirits who had haunted the house for so long had finally found their rest. The house stood silent behind him, its dark secrets finally laid to rest, its shadows fading into the light, leaving only the memory of a sorrow that had once bound it, a sorrow that had finally, mercifully, been released. Chapter 10. The Final Rest. As Edgar walked away from the house, his footsteps felt lighter, his mind unburdened in a way he could hardly remember. The dense fog around the lake was lifting, the morning sun piercing through the mist, casting gentle beams across the water. A silence blanketed the surroundings, yet it was no longer oppressive. Instead, it was peaceful, a quiet that spoke of endings, of chapters closed. But as Edgar turned to take one last look at the house, a chill prickled his skin. Even in the morning light, the old structure seemed to pulse faintly with a dark energy, as though it held one last secret it was reluctant to release. A strange calm settled over him, yet Edgar felt an eerie sense of being watched, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper calling from within. He couldn't leave, not yet. Yours, the return to the house. Without entirely understanding why, Edgar stepped back onto the property, his movements slow and deliberate. His skin prickled as he crossed the threshold, the familiar musty scent of the house embracing him like an old ghost. The shadows were thinner now, the rooms filled with more light than he'd ever seen, and yet he sensed a presence lingering in the air, a fragment of sorrow that hadn't fully dissipated. The house's silence was no longer deafening, but gentle, almost inviting. Edgar's feet led him to the parlor, where the portraits of past occupants hung, their eyes tracking him with the same haunted sorrow he had come to know. But as he looked closely, something about the faces seemed changed, their expressions softer, less tormented, as if the spirits had found a measure of peace. Then, from the corner of his eye, he glimpsed a shadow, a fleeting figure at the far end of the hall, one that vanished as soon as he turned. Edgar's heart thudded, yet he felt no fear. Something deep within him knew that he was meant to follow. The spirit's revelation. The hallway seemed longer than he remembered, stretching into shadows that thickened and twisted with each step. He felt a strange pull toward the staircase that led down into the basement, where the unmarked grave had been. The path seemed familiar, yet different, as though the house itself were guiding him. At the foot of the stairs, the basement lay dark and silent, the cold air thick and unmoving. Edgar felt his breath catch as he saw the figure standing by the grave, a faint, transparent shape that shimmered with an ethereal glow. It was Isabella. She was no longer the vengeful spectre he had come to fear, nor the sorrowful apparition that had haunted his dreams. Instead, she stood before him with a soft, serene expression, her hollow eyes now filled with a gentle light, a forgiveness that radiated from her very being. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a soft melody that drifted through the air, "for seeing us, for understanding. But there is still one final truth you must know." Edgar's heart thudded as he listened, his mind reeling with questions. But he held his tongue, sensing that this final revelation was something he could not rush. The final truth. Isabella raised a hand, gesturing toward the wall of the basement. There, concealed behind an aged tapestry, was a hidden alcove, its entrance dark and uninviting. Edgar stepped toward it, his hands trembling as he pushed the tapestry aside, revealing a narrow passageway that led deeper into the earth. The passage opened into a small chamber, where the walls were lined with bookshelves filled with tomes, letters, and artifacts, centuries of secrets, carefully hidden from prying eyes. At the center of the room lay a large book, its cover cracked and worn, the spine barely holding together. He opened it with trembling hands, each page filled with names, dates, and dark symbols. It was a record of everyone who had ever lived or died on this land, a catalogue of each spirit that had been bound to the house, each soul that had been unable to rest. And then he saw it, his own name, written in faded ink, barely visible beneath the smudged entries. Edgar felt his pulse quicken, his vision blurring as the truth settled over him like a shroud. This was not the first time he had been here. He had lived this life before, trapped in an endless cycle of sorrow, drawn back to the house time and time again, each life blending into the next, each death merging into an eternity of darkness. The house had claimed him, binding his soul to its walls, forcing him to relive the same torments, the same betrayals, the same unending sorrow. And Isabella, she had been there through it all, bound to him by a connection that neither time nor death could sever. They were two parts of the same tragedy, souls entwined by the house's dark curse, condemned to live and die within its walls, always reaching for freedom, always falling short. Fouki, the choice. As the truth settled over him, Isabella's voice cut through the silence, gentle yet firm. "This is your chance, Edgar," she said. "You can break the cycle, but only if you choose to let go. If you leave now, if you walk away, you can free us both. But if you stay, if you seek vengeance, the cycle will begin again." Edgar felt a rush of emotions, a lifetime's worth of sorrow, anger, and despair, emotions that had bound him to the house, to Isabella, to the darkness that had claimed them both. He could feel the weight of each life he had lived, each death he had suffered, pressing down on him like a stone, a reminder of the endless pain that had held him captive. But he could also feel something else, a glimmer of hope, a light that had not been there before. The choice was his, and his alone. He could walk away, leave the house behind, release Isabella, the child, and himself from the darkness that had bound them all. With a deep breath, Edgar looked into Isabella's eyes, his heart pounding as he made his decision. The release. Edgar reached out, his hand brushing against Isabella's. Her form began to fade, her figure dissolving into a soft, ethereal glow that filled the room with a warmth that felt like sunlight breaking through the clouds. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, filled with a gratitude so deep it brought tears to his eyes. For everything. And then she was gone. Her spirit finally free, her soul released from the house's grip, leaving only a faint whisper in the air, a memory of the sorrow that had bound them both. The house seemed to breathe, the walls shuddering as though exhaling a final relieved sigh. Edgar felt the weight lift from his shoulders, the darkness dissipating, replaced by a peace that filled him with a warmth he had never known. The shadows receded, the silence softened, and for the first time the house felt empty. Not haunted, not cursed, but empty, as though it were finally at rest. The departure. Edgar walked through the halls one last time, each room bathed in the soft morning light. The darkness that had plagued it for centuries now lifted. The faces in the portraits seemed different, their expressions softened, their eyes no longer filled with sorrow but with peace, as though they too had found release. He stepped outside, the sun warm on his face, the air filled with the scent of earth and grass. The lake was still, its surface calm, reflecting the sky above with a clarity that seemed almost unnatural. As he looked back at the house, he felt a strange sense of gratitude, an understanding that, despite all the horror, the darkness, the sorrow, it had given him something he had never known: peace, closure, and a final, bittersweet release. He took one last look at the house, its silent walls standing as a testament to the lives it had claimed, the stories it had held, the souls it had bound. And then, with a deep breath, he turned away, leaving it behind, the final echoes of its darkness fading with each step. Fanam Vromomshan, the legacy of shadows years past, and the house remained empty, its walls silent, its shadows gone. The townspeople spoke of it in hushed tones, sharing stories of the hauntings, the tragedies, the strange disappearances that had plagued it for centuries. But over time, the stories faded, the house forgotten, its walls covered in ivy, its windows broken, its doors locked and barred. It became a relic, a memory of a dark past, a ghost of a life that had been lived and lost within its walls. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the trees and the lake lay still, some swore they could hear a voice, soft and sorrowful, drifting through the air, a faint echo of a story that had been laid to rest. It was said that the house was empty now, its spirits released, its shadows gone. But those who listened closely, who dared to stand at the lake's edge in the dead of night, claimed they could still see a figure standing by the water, her hollow eyes filled with a sadness that would never fade, her voice a faint whisper that echoed through the darkness. And somewhere, deep in the house's empty halls, a locket lay, tarnished and forgotten, a relic of a love lost, a betrayal forgiven, a cycle broken. And as the wind swept through the empty rooms, it carried with it the faintest echo of a final goodbye, a whisper of peace, a reminder that, in the end, even the darkest shadows could find rest. The end.